Konnichiwa minasan, and welcome to the class in the second lecture series on Introduction to Japanese Language and Culture. I am very happy that you all are so eager to learn Japanese, and I am also happy that I am able to address all your queries and I am able to satisfy all the questions that you keep putting up on the forum. Now, I have received a lot of mails from students that they want to do more kanji characters. So, well, I am going to do kanji characters in our upcoming lessons now, and with that I will also do expressions, your greetings, festivals in Japan, and a lot of other things. So, coming back to the class, well, this class is a continuation, as you already know, and we are going to do comparisons over here, which we were doing in our previous class. So, let us see what new we have here in your lesson. So, well, last time you did comparison between two things. Now, today I will show you that comparison can also be done between three things or three or more things. So, what are the words we are going to use and how it is going to be done? We will do it right now. So, well, this is what you have done earlier. Anata wa A ga suki desu ka, B ga suki desu ka? Or we can also remove this from here and just A ga suki desu ka, B ga suki desu ka with a rising intonation, and you are asking somebody. So, well, A desu ka, B desu ka. So, this ka over here is the question marker, and this ka is equivalent to or in English. So, now let us see what is the answer. Watashi wa A ga suki desu. Direct answer ga because of ski. Ski will take always ga because you are stating something. Now, another way you can answer is watashi wa A no hou ga suki desu. A is noun 1. So, noun no hou ga suki desu. The moment you say hou ga, you show or the listener will understand that there is something else as well. You have shown two things and this is what you choose. Now, there can be another way to answer. Anata wa A yori B no hou ga suki desu ka? So, you prefer B to A. So, now it is very clear with hou ga that you prefer, your preference is very, very clear when you use yori, A yori, more than A. So, now two things are there and more than A, I prefer B, I choose B. So, same question and you can answer in different ways, all in a broad sense mean the same, but well, understanding by the listener could be very different, or what you want to convey could be very different. Now, when you ask this question A ga suki desu ka, B ga suki desu ka, then A ga suki desu. Now, when you ask anata wa A yori B no hou ga suki desu ka, then the answer would be either hai or ie. So, direct answer, short answer, hai or ie, and you are talking about two things, noun 1 and noun 2 over here, comparing two things. Now, today we want to do more things over here, but first what is the question that we are going to ask? This does not have a question word, you can see over here very clearly, A yori B no hou ga suki desu ka, but where is the question word? So, let us see the question word. Noun 1 to, noun 2 to, dochira ga adjective. this to over here is and before dochira always to will be used. A to, B to, this and this one. Dochira ga, whatever the adjective, it could be any na adjective or I adjective. So, well, anata wa A to B to dochira ga for ski desu ka? And now we will do dochira over here. So, dochira, as I have told you earlier, is direction, used for direction and also which one of the two. So, for example, you can say Tokyo to Osaka to dochira ga ookii desu ka? Which one of the two things? Dochira ga ookii desu ka? When you ask in this manner, then A and B both are known or A and B are shown to the speaker. Which one of the two? As you can see over here, which one of the two things. Now, this is formal, dochi. This is informal, meaning is the same. A to B to dochi ga suki? So, you can make it very, very informal by not using this to your friends, to people younger to you, your colleagues in an informal situation. Don't have to use desu ka all the time. You can just say A to B to dochi ga suki and the intonation is rising. I think it is very clear with dochira. We will practice now and you can see very clearly. So, ski can be used, na adjective, hayai I adjective, oishii I adjective. Keiki to chocolate to dochira ga oishii desu ka? Or Shinkansen to densha to dochi ga hayai? Informal. So, well, you can practice now. Anata wa Tokyo to Kyoto to dochira ga ookii, suki, kirei desu ka? So, you can use any adjective you want over here depending on what you are using here. Please remember that you just can't use adjectives randomly. So, anata wa Tokyo to Kyoto to dochira ga ookii desu ka? Which one is larger or bigger or more beautiful or ski? Which one do you like? Do you like Tokyo? Do you like Kyoto? You can also say Tokyo ga suki desu ka? Kyoto ga suki desu ka? Same question in this manner. Now, Rao-san to Mira-san to dochira ga suki or dochira ga wakai? Comparing to, now it is people. So, you can basically compare noun 1 plus noun 2, these two, and plus over here will be to. Now, dochira and dochi, used for comparing or selecting between two things, as I just told you, and particle to is what you will use before dochira. That is the most important part. That is the construction. Noun 1 to, noun 2 to, dochira ga adjective. This is the pattern. Try to make more sentences with this, and this we are going to do just now in our next slide. Do, dochira, dochi and dore mean the same. Now, another way of comparing is by using nakade. So, how will you do that? Well, noun 1 to, noun 2 to, noun 3, no nakade, within these 3 nouns. So, now you will see that dochira and dochi, you will use noun 1 plus noun 2 only, but with nakade you can use 3 over here as is given. Why? because dochira, dochi, dore, you are showing something, you are physically showing, or the noun is known. But here these three things are present over here, and within these three things, please remember, dore, doko, nani, itsu, dare. Question word, ga, adjective, desu ka. For example, dore is which one of the two? Doko, where, nani, what, itsu, when, and dare, who. So, dare is used for people, itsu for time, nani for things, doko for place, where, and dore is which one for things. Now, I will do it in detail also, we can practice over here. So, with dochira, naka will not be used, naka, de. If you have three nouns, then naka will be used, and the question word. Now, you can practice over here. Eto, bito, dochira ga suki desu ka? You will see eto, bito, sito will not be used. Then, watashi wa A ga suki desu, you did just now. Watashi wa A yori B ga suki desu, this also you did in your previous slide. I prefer B. Then, watashi wa A yori B no hou ga suki desu, this also you did in your previous slide. Now, watashi wa A to B to C no naka de. Now, this you will understand better, naka kara, from this set of three things which are present over here or which I know about. Watashi wa A to B to C no naka de or naka kara B ga suki desu. I like B. So, keiki to chocolate to candy no naka de or candy no naka kara chocolate ga suki desu. That is how you will use it. Now, ringo to mikan to budo, that is exactly what is given over here. These are fruits, kudamono. Ringo to mikan to budo no naka de dore ga, which one from the three which I am showing to you ga oishii desu ka, or I am asking about. For example, you go to a fruit vendor and you have these things nicely stacked over there. So, you ask ringo to mikan to budo to dore ga yasui desu ka, which one is cheap or which one is oishii. So, this situation can be there. No naka de or no naka kara. Bus to densha to jitensha, same modes of transport. No naka kara or naka de dore ga hayai desu ka, fast. Hayai desu ka. Now, there is a kanji over here, it is an easy kanji. So, we will do it and you will remember it very, very quickly. This is nichi and ju. So, hayai. Once again, hayai. It is given over here. You can see the stroke order, and kurma of course we did like this. Now, Tokyo to Osaka to Sapporo. Sapporo is the capital of the topmost island, which is Hokkaido no naka de. So, these are three cities, big cities in Japan. So, Tokyo to Osaka to Sapporo no naka de dore ga hiroi desu ka? Hiroi. We also did hiroi last time. Hiroi. Daijoubu desu ka? Mou ne wakaru to omoimasu when you compare three things. Now, there was this noun or question word dore. Dore is from the series kore, sore, are and dore. So, used for things. And how will you see? Comparing or selecting from two or more options, using nakade and to. So, noun 1 to, noun 2 to, noun 3 no nakade, and this to means and. It is also very informal. So, when you are talking to seniors, then please always use desu ka and not just noun 1 to noun 2 to noun 3 no naka de dore ga oishii, and the intonation is rising. Chocolate to cake to candy no naka de dore ga oishii, and intonation is rising. Do not use this with seniors. In formal situations, always add desu ka at the end. Now, there is another word Ichiban, and Ichiban means first, but over here we are going to use Ichiban in a different way. Now, what is the meaning of Ichiban over here? Means most. So, noun 1 to, noun 2 to, noun 3 to. There is a mistake over here. So, noun 1 to, noun 2 to, noun 3 to, dore, doko, dare, itsu ga ichiban, whatever the adjective, desu ka. Flat intonation. If you want to finish over here, then the intonation is always rising. This is formal and this is informal. So, now you can practice here. The adjectives are hayai, oki, atsui and ski. You can forget this for the time being. We will just remove it from here. Atsui. Now, I just did the kanji with you. Before I go any further, I will do the kanji. So, hayai, oki, suki. So, again and again we will see these characters and I am sure you will be able to memorize them. So, noun 1 to noun 2 to, noun 3 to, dore ga ichiban, most hayai desu ka, most oki desu ka, most atsui desu ka, most ski desu ka. That is how it is understood, most ichiban. Now, you can see and practice over here. Hikoki to fune to densha no naka de, or hikoki to fune to densha to dore ga ichiban hayai desu ka. Mumbai to Chennai to Delhi to dore ga ichiban oki desu ka, or kirei desu ka. 5月と6月と7月といつが time 一番暑いですか? And then use this and see on your own what it is. Tell me. Yakyu is baseball, cricket is cricket, and football is, of course, you know. So, 野球とクリケットとフットボールの中でどれが好きですか? Or 野球とクリケットとフットボールとどれが一番好きですか? わかりました？皆さん。たくさん作ってください。そして文章を作って友達に聞いてください。質問してください。そして自分で答えてください。いいですか？たくさん文章を作って友達と一緒に練習すればすぐわかると思います。Answer could be 野球が一番好きです。or ムンバイが一番大きいです。5月が一番暑いです。インドは5月と6月が一番暑いです。Now, we have dore, doko, dono itsu, dare. What does it mean? We have done a number of times, it is just that it is good to revise. So, dore is used for things as I just told you. Dore desu ka? Doko desu ka? Where? Doko desu ka? Dono hon desu ka? Which hon are you talking about? Which of the two? Dore is also two. Then itsu is when. Itsu ga atsui desu ka? Time. Then dare is for people who, or donata is polite. So, I am sure you are very familiar with this, just go over it once and you will be able to use them very easily in conversation. Now, we are talking about groups. What do you mean by group? Group is, for example, words like yasai is a group, vegetables, tomodachi within that group of friends, tori within that group of birds, or you could have dobutsu within the group of animals. So, a certain group no nakade, within that group, dore or nani ga ichiban, whatever the adjective, desu ka. So, you will only use dore and nani. Now, you can practice with these examples over here. Kudamono no naka de nani ga ichiban suki desu ka? So, I am quite sure it is very clear. What do you like in fruits? Within the group of fruits. Ringo ga ichiban suki desu. I like it most. Kotsu kikan no naka de nani ga ichiban hayai desu ka? Kotsu kikan is transportation. No naka de nani ga which, what is ichiban most, hayai is fast or quick. Densha ga ichiban hayai desu. Transportation systems, kotsu kikan. Now, there is another one for you. Gakusei no naka de, within students, dare ga ichiban majime desu ka? Majime is hardworking. Taro ga ichiban majime desu. So, answer is that this gakusei is very, very hardworking. Now, there is this example for you. You have lot of groups over here. Sports, within sports, gakusei within students, tomodachi within friends, sensei gata within this group of teachers, donna, dare, nani, doko you can use. You have just learnt all of this, so you can use and make good sentences with benri, suki, omoshiroi and kashikoi. Kashikoi is intelligent. Intelligent. So, you can practice with your partner. Ask questions like this and answer. Now, when talking informally or asking preference or choice, what do you say? Group no naka de nani ga ichiban, whatever the adjective, you just now did it. So, this is a general statement. This is what you would ask, that within a certain group, what is ichiban, what is most, and depending on the adjective, the meaning will come. We did it just now in our previous slide, but this is within a group. But if we choose maybe from a basket or from a box or from something that is lying on the table, maybe there are a lot of fruits lying on the table, then what are we going to say? Well, in such cases, because a certain number is being mentioned, as I just gave this example to you, that if you have something in a basket or if you have something in a box or on the table, say you have a lot of fruits, a lot of vegetables somewhere on a table, maybe there are a lot of candies in a box. So, at a certain point, at a certain place or inside something, a certain number can be seen, a certain amount can be seen or can be shown, and thus what are we going to use? We are going to use dore and nani. Now, this sounds very, very confusing. You can understand it better when you look at the example. Now you see that this is a small basket of fruits or a bowl of fruits. So there is a certain number of fruits at a place. So what are you going to say? Well, kudamono no naka de nani ga ichiban suki desu ka? So in this case, it is group of fruits in general, isn't it? We are just talking about fruits as a whole, as a group. So kudamono no naka de nani ga ichiban suki desu ka? Understood. But if we look at this, where some fruits are there in a basket, then hako no kudamono no naka de dore ga ichiban suki desu ka? So you are not talking about kudamono as a group, you are talking about kudamono which is kept over here in this bowl, or maybe kept in a box, or it could be also kept on a table, and whatever is seen on the table, dore ga ichiban suki desu ka? So in a similar manner, hako no naka no kudamono, this will make it even more clear, no naka de dore ga ichiban suki desu ka? So specific fruits kept at a certain place. You can also understand it with dobutsu no naka de donna dobutsu ga ichiban suki desu ka? So all dobutsu in one group, but dobutsu en no naka no dobutsu, then only animals present in the zoo. Which one do you like most? Now there is a small conversation. Listen to the conversation and let us see how many new forms and new words you can understand from the conversation. So this conversation is between Tanaka-san and Teinin-san. And where is the conversation happening? It is at a restaurant. So, sumimasen, baga futatsu onegai shimasu. Baga is burger. Futatsu is 2. Onegai shimasu, please. Moshiwake arimasen. Baga wa mo urikire desu. Ah, moshiwake arimasen. I am extremely sorry. So, this is the most polite way of apologizing. You have seen sumimasen, gomenasai, then moshiwake arimasen. I am sorry, but I have to tell you that it is not available. Baga wa mo already urikire desu. All sold out. Ah, so sugu dekiru mono wa, sugu is immediately. Dekiru, you have done dekimasu, which can be made. Mono is thing, wa, and he leaves it incomplete. So the teinin says, yakisoba to udon ga sugu dekimasu. Immediately I can make it. So Tanaka asks Mira, Mira-san do shimasu ka? What are you going to do? Do shimasu. Shimasu is suru. Watashi wa yakisoba mo suki desu kara yakisoba ni shimasu. I will take yakisoba. Mo suki, I also like yakisoba, thus I am all right with yakisoba. Ja, yakisoba in that case. Well then, yakisoba to kohi futatsu onegai shimasu. Please get yakisoba and kohi futatsu onegai shimasu. A simple conversation. There are a few new things. We are going to do it right now. There is nani, taberu, kesa, owaru. We are going to cover these. Now there was a word mo. What does mo mean? Mo has different usage and means already. And we will see all the others as well. Simple question. Tegami o kakimashita ka? Iie, mada desu. Not yet. We have done this earlier. Not yet. Or, hai, mo kakimashita. I have already written kakimashita. So, mada is to be used with ie and mo in past form of the verb, ta form of the verb as already and hai mo kakimashita. Please remember, this is a pattern. If you are asked a question and you have completed the work, well, hai mo kakimashita, and if you have not completed it, not done the work, then iie mada desu. So, mo kakimashita, and this is mo and not mo. This mo is also and this is already. So, in past form like this, verb in ta form or mashita form, work is over. It has been done, completed. Mo kakimashita. Tanaka-san wa doko? Mo kairimashita. He has already returned. Gohan o tabemashita ka? Hai, mo tabemashita. I have already eaten. So, now if you have in mass form, what is going to happen? What is the meaning? So, it is very clear that if it is in mass form, then the action is not over, work is not completed. Okay? So, mo kakimasu, I will write soon, not immediately, but I will write. I have plans of writing. For example, tabemashita ka? Iie mada desu, or mo tabemasu. From now on, I will go for eating, or I will start eating, or very soon I will eat. Now, if it is in negative, what does it mean? Mo kikimasen, mo kakimasen. So, tegami o kakimashita ka? Same question. Tegami o kakimashita ka? Mo kakimasen. I will not write any more. I have had enough. I will not write any more. Tanaka-san ni aimashita ka? Aimashita ka? So, mada desu, not yet. Hai, aimashita. Mo aimashita, I have already met. Or mo aimasen, I will not meet him any more. So, is it clear now? Gohan o tabemashita ka? Mo takusan tabemashita kara mo tabemasen. I will not have any more as I have had lots. So, you will see with mashita meaning is different, mas form it is different, negative it is different, and then if you have masho form, what does it mean? It means let's do whatever the verb is saying. Mo tabemashita ka? Iie mada desu. Or you can also say mo tabemashou. So, it is already getting late, let's have now. Masho form is always doing things together, meaning let's, so let's eat. It is already late, so let's eat. Another easy example, rokuji desu ka? Hai, mo rokuji desu. Mo rokuji desu. So, another easy example is mo rokuji desu. Ah, osoi desu ne. Mo kairimashou. Let's go home. So, how to use mo with past, present, negative and mashou. Now, there are a few kanjis here which I want to do. You have done this kanji. What is this? This is te, and you have done it with jozu, isn't it? Or heta, heta and jozu, isn't it? And this is te. Now, we are going to do it with tegami, which is letter. So, te and gami. Now, like this. Gami means paper and this is te. Writing on paper with te is tegami. This part, this is a 6-stroke character. this is 3 and this is 3. This is chisai. Together is ito, which is thread. Over here you can see this portion in paper. So, when the kanji comes in second place, kami, which is paper, becomes gami over here. Now, there is another kanji which is kaku. You need to know kaku because you can see it is written all over here also, and this kanji generally comes in the exam in JLPT. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. Please remember, this is not the stroke order. The stroke order is a little different, but I find it easy, so I write it. And nichi over here. This is kaku. Kaku. Once again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6 over here. And then nichi, kaku. Then there was ski again over there, suki. So, you can remember these kanjis. Now, look at this. Mira wa mo kairimashita ka? One answer you have done is hai kairimashita or iie mada desu. Now, hai kaitte kimashita. Now, what is the difference between the two? Hai kairimashita and hai kaitte kimashita. What does it mean? Well, very simple. When you say hai kairimashita, Mira wa mo kairimashita ka? So, maybe at workplace, wherever she is working or wherever she is, imasu, present, from there she has returned. Okay? And the question is asked over here, workplace or where she is studying, where she is, maybe at park, gakko, office, kaisha, anywhere. When you say hai kaitte kimashita, definitely this is home. Oto-san is asking or oka-san is asking, Mira wa mo kairimashita ka? Has she returned? So, this question is for both, but answer shows where Mira is. Hai kaete kimashita, she has returned. Please see the difference, go over it again and again and you will understand. Visualize, put yourself in that position, ask the question and see how clear it is. Now, there was a word sugu in the conversation. Let us see how sugu can be used in our sentences and what it means. So, sugu, as you know, is an adverb meaning immediately, right away, at once. How? Sugu ikimasu, I will go immediately, very, very clear. Sugu ikimasu. Someone says, are you going? So, yeah, I am going, just now I am leaving. So, sugu ikimasu. Sugu shukudai o shimasen. I will not do my shukudai immediately. I will first relax, take a bath, watch TV, have food and then do my shukudai. Sugu shimasen, meaning I will do it later. Nai is in plain form, masen is in mas form. Now, sugu shukudai o shimashou. Let us do our shukudai immediately. Let us complete our shukudai immediately. Sugu shukudai o shimashou means let us do quickly or right away. Then, sugu shukudai o shita houga ii desu. Sugu shukudai shita houga ii desu, meaning it is better that you do the shukudai immediately, right away. Now, sugu is also written like this in kanji, but most of the time we write sugu in hiragana. Sugaku no ano mondai wa sugu dekita. Sugaku is maths, no ano mondai. This shows very clearly that the speaker and the listener both know which problem, which question they are talking about. Sugu dekita, I could do it immediately. Then Sugu shukudai o shinasai. Now there is a star over here and you can understand that this is special. What is this? Now this is another conjugation which is a direct order. It's a command. So generally it comes from top to bottom. Oka-san, Oto-san, elder brothers and sisters, そして先生方みんなしなさいは言えるけど子供は言わない方がいいです。失礼なことになります。だからしなさい please do not use with elders. Only people younger to you, your juniors, you can order them. Of course, the Japanese don't order like this. These are basically classroom expressions that you do it to students or at home by mothers. Sugu shukudai o shinasai. Your mother will always tell you, come on, quickly finish your homework. So there is no please, no request over there, just an order. Now there is a kanji over here of iku, which is like this, I and ku. And kan is there, you can see kan again for you, and gaku is there, dai gaku. Is it okay? 3 characters. We have done them, so I am just quickly writing them for you so that you can see. Shukudai you don't have to worry, we will do it some other time. Now we have mosugu. What does mosugu mean? Very soon or shortly. So not immediately but after a while. So Nihon ni kite mosugu 2年になります。Very soon it's going to be 2 years. 日本に来てから after coming to Japan. Then 試験はもうすぐです。Test is going to be very soon. Again very soon の意味です。もうすぐね。もうすぐ。試験 is test. 子供たちはもうすぐ夏休みです。夏休み which is summer break, summer holidays is going to be very very soon. It's coming soon. 母はもうすぐ50歳です。So my mother is going to be 50 years very soon. Now this is for you all and I am sure this will make it very clear. 皆さんはもうすぐ300ぐらい approximately about 300 漢字がわかりますよ。もうすぐ very soon you will be able to understand 300 kanji characters. Now there are some kanjis again over here. So kuru like this. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7. 7 stroke character means kuru. Group 3. Then you have ninen right here. So ni is like this and nen you did last time like this, nen. The stroke order is a little different, but you can look up the stroke order on your own on the net. Then there is yasumi like this under the tree, yasu and mi. And with yasumi we can learn another character which is very similar and that is karada. So you just cut this and make karada which is body. Then haha over here. So lot of kanjis for you, you can practice those at home. Then there was another word do. Now what does do mean? It is used with shimas, do shimasu ka. It is informal and so it clearly shows indecision or confusion on part of the speaker. The speaker wants to take some time to say something or to think as to what to say. Now when you say do shimasu ka, it is a direct question and the speaker wants the listener's opinion, what he thinks about a certain situation. Shimasho is the volitional form, as you know you have done for suru, which is group 3. So, let us see what do shimasho is from these examples. Kore wa dou desu ka? How about? What about this one? So, kore, you are showing something, one or two things. So, from those one or two things, what about this one? Do you imi desu ka? You have done it with you, means to speak or to say. So, do you imi, what do you mean? What do you want to say? What do you want to convey? Do shimasho, what shall we do? For example, you are getting late. Should you take a taxi or should you take a bus? So, you are asking your partner, do shimasho. Taxi is going to be expensive, bus is going to be cheap, but it is going to take a lot of time. So, what shall we do? There is confusion. Do shimasho ka. So, over here direct question, do shimasho, informal, do shimasho ka, polite and taking the other person's opinion into consideration. Then do shimashita ka, what has happened? So, somebody is looking for something, you go over there and you ask him, do shimashita ka, what has happened? Or there is a fight or an argument between two people and you try to sort of control the situation and you say, do shimashita ka? Then do omoimasu ka? Now, omoimasu you have done earlier, means think, and you know omoimasu will take particle to always, but with do, particle to will not be used when you are using omoimasu. So, do omoimasu ka, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? So, you can see very clearly how do can be used in conversation to ask questions in different situations. Now, there are adjectives over here for you: benri, wakai, kirai, oishi, yasashi, fumajime, kirei, ichiban, heta, jozu, nagai and takai. Now, ichiban is not an adjective, all the others are adjectives. Then we have urikire. Urikire is something that is sold out generally at shops, in fetes and in melas, where you make something and you go and sell. Then if it is sold out, it is urikire desu. Then mo you have already done: yakisoba, udon, yasai, kudamono, hako, kotsuki-kan, jitensha and sugu. Sugu is an adverb over here, rest are all nouns. And make sentences with this, practice with your partner. I am sure that today comparisons is very clear to you, when to use hoga, when to use yori, when to use dochira, no nakade, ichiban, all these, and how to compare nouns and show preference. Practice all this. There is lot of kanji also that we covered here. There is mo, sugu, do. Make sentences, talk to your partner, and please remember, whenever you are talking or whenever you are practicing with your partner, please practice loudly. That gives confidence and that clears all the doubts. You do not fumble. So, with this, I think I will end today's class and we will meet again next time. Do something new. Arigatou gozaimasu. Minasan mata aimashou.